A voice sharp as broken glass sliced through the hushed ambience of the first-class cabin. "Excuse me, I think you're in the wrong section." Every head turned. 17-year-old Jordan Carter looked up from his tablet, blinking in confusion at the woman standing over him, her face a mask of condescending disapproval. "This is first class," she enunciated slowly, as if speaking to a child. "Economy is in the back." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with the unspoken prejudice in her words. For a moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Little did anyone know this wasn't just an argument over a seat. It was a reckoning that would follow one passenger 30,000 feet down to the ground and shatter her entire world. The scent of premium leather and subtle clean fragrance filled Jordan Carter's senses as he stepped into the first-class cabin of Swiss International Airlines Flight 87, bound for Geneva. For a 17-year-old, this was the stuff of dreams. His heart hammered a rhythm against his ribs that was a mix of adolescent excitement and genuine awe. This wasn't just a flight, it was a victory lap. Tucked into the front pocket of his backpack beside his state-of-the-art laptop was an invitation to the Global Youth Innovators Summit, a prestigious competition where he was a finalist for designing a revolutionary water purification app. His parents, a high school principal and a software engineer, had pooled their savings and airline miles to buy him this ticket. "You've earned the right to stretch your legs, son," his dad had said, clapping him on the back at the JFK departure gate. "Go make us proud." Jordan found his seat 2A, a spacious pod by the window. He ran his hand over the smooth, cool surface of the console, marveling at the sheer luxury of it all. He was used to being crammed in economy, his knees pressed against the seat in front of him. This was a different universe. He carefully stowed his carry-on in the overhead bin, his well-worn MIT hoodie, a stark contrast to the designer suits and expensive perfumes of the other passengers trickling in. He didn't care. The hoodie was his good luck charm, a symbol of the future he was working so hard to build. He settled into the plush seat, which felt more like a throne, and immediately pulled out his tablet to go over his presentation notes one last time. He was so engrossed in his code, a complex algorithm that mimicked the filtration properties of mangrove roots, that he barely noticed the other passengers boarding. The low hum of polite conversation, the clinking of glasses as the flight attendants offered pre-departure champagne, it all faded into a background buzz. A sharp sigh from across the aisle finally broke his concentration. He glanced up to see a woman in her late 50s stuffing a stiff leather briefcase into the bin above her seat 2D. She wore a severe charcoal grey pantsuit that looked expensive but uncomfortable, and her blonde hair was sprayed into a perfect immovable helmet. Her face was etched with lines of chronic dissatisfaction. As she settled into her seat, her eyes swept the cabin with an air of proprietary inspection finally landing on Jordan. Her gaze lingered. It wasn't a curious glance. It was an assessment, cold and dismissive. He saw her eyes flick from his face to his hoodie to the sneakers on his feet, and a faint, almost imperceptible sneer tightened her lips. Jordan had seen that look before. It was the look that questioned his presence in advanced placement classes, the look that followed him in high-end stores, the look that wordlessly asked, "What are you doing here?" He met her gaze for a brief second before looking back down at his tablet, a familiar knot tightening in his stomach. He refused to let her ruin this moment. He belonged here. His ticket, his hard work, and his parents' sacrifice had put him in this seat. The flight attendant, a warm-eyed woman named Grace, came by to offer him a drink. "Orange juice, please," Jordan said with a polite smile. "Of course." Grace replied, her own smile genuine. As Grace served him, the woman in 2D watched the interaction with narrowed eyes. She flagged down the attendant with an impatient snap of her fingers. "I'll have a glass of the Bollinger, and quickly. It seems we're letting just about anyone in here these days." Her voice was low, but carried a venomous edge that was clearly intended for Jordan to overhear. Grace's professional smile didn't waver, but a flicker of annoyance crossed her features. "Right away, ma'am," she said, before turning back to Jordan. "Let me know if you need anything at all during the flight." Jordan just nodded, the knot in his stomach growing colder. He put in his noise-cancelling headphones, hoping to drown out the woman's hostile energy. He focused on the safety demonstration video playing on the large screen in front of him, trying to recapture the excitement he had felt just minutes before. The cabin doors were sealed, the jet bridge retracted, and the powerful engines began to spool up with a deep, promising roar. The plane began its slow taxi toward the runway. He was on his way. He was flying towards his future, cocooned in a bubble of luxury he had only ever dreamed of. But he couldn't shake the feeling that a storm was brewing right there in the climate-controlled quiet of seat 2D. The woman across the aisle was a thundercloud waiting to burst, and he had a sinking feeling that he was the lightning rod. He just hoped he was wrong. As the Airbus A330 leveled off at its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, the gentle chime for the seatbelt sign to be turned off echoed through the cabin. A sense of calm settled over the passengers. The murmur of conversation resumed. Laptops were opened, and the clink of silverware on china began to emanate from the galley as the cabin crew prepared for the dinner service. Jordan, having finally shaken off the unease from his encounter with the woman in 2D, was deeply engrossed in a documentary on quantum computing, his headphones creating a private world of scientific discovery. The tranquility was shattered by a shadow falling over his screen. He looked up to see the woman from 2D standing over him. Her arms were crossed, and her face was a thunderous mask of indignation. Her name, he would later learn, was Karen Miller. "I'm going to ask you one more time," she said, her voice laced with a cold fury that cut through the cabin's quiet hum. "What are you doing in this seat?" Jordan slowly removed his headphones. "I'm sorry," he asked, genuinely confused by her aggression. "Don't play dumb with me, young man," she snapped, her voice rising in volume, attracting the attention of the passengers in the surrounding seats. "This is a first-class cabin. It is for paying customers. I know for a fact that you couldn't possibly afford a ticket like this. Did you sneak up here from economy? Are you hoping no one would notice?" The accusation hung in the air, ugly and preposterous. Jordan felt a hot flush of embarrassment and anger creep up his neck. Every eye in the small, intimate cabin was now fixed on them. He could feel the weight of their stares, a mixture of curiosity, discomfort, and pity. He took a deep breath, reminding himself of his mother's constant advice. "Dignity, Jordan. Always lead with dignity." "Ma'am," he began, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I can assure you this is my assigned seat. My boarding pass is right here." He gestured toward the pocket of the seat in front of him, where he had tucked the pass. Karen Miller let out a short, derisive laugh. "A boarding pass. You probably forged it. Or maybe you're sitting here for a friend, a flight attendant who is letting you bend the rules." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial yet loud whisper. "I've seen your type before. You think the rules don't apply to you. You think you can just take what isn't yours." The thinly veiled racism was now laid bare for everyone to see. "My type," Jordan repeated, his voice quiet but firm. "Ma'am, the only type I am is a passenger on this flight, just like you." Her face contorted with rage. Her sense of order, her belief in a world where people stayed in their designated places, was being challenged by a teenager in a hoodie. "This is ridiculous. I paid thousands of dollars for my ticket. Thousands I paid for exclusivity and comfort, not to be surrounded by people who don't belong." She gestured wildly around the cabin, as if Jordan's mere presence had contaminated the air. "I demand that you move to the back of the plane where you belong right now." She screeched, the last vestiges of her composure gone. She pointed a trembling finger toward the curtain that separated first class from business class. "Go on, before I have you forcibly removed." Jordan sat frozen in his seat, stunned into silence by the sheer audacity and venom of her attack. He felt small, exposed, and utterly humiliated. He was a 17-year-old boy, traveling alone for the first time internationally, on his way to the biggest opportunity of his life, and he was being publicly accosted and racially profiled. He had rehearsed his presentation 100 times, prepared for complex questions from world-renowned judges, but he had never prepared for this. He saw Grace, the flight attendant, hurrying down the aisle, her face a mixture of alarm and professional resolve. But before she could reach them, the eruption had already caused a seismic shift in the cabin. The bubble of privileged indifference had burst. The other passengers were no longer passive observers. They were witnesses. And in that charged, tense moment, the silence was about to be broken by more than just Karen Miller's hateful tirade. The carefully constructed world she believed she commanded was about to crumble around her, one passenger at a time. The first crack in her foundation was about to appear from the seat directly across the aisle. The silence that followed Karen Miller's screeching demand was thick and suffocating. It was a silence born of shock and discomfort. Then a calm, authoritative voice emerged from seat 3C, just behind Jordan. "That's quite enough." All eyes, including Karen's, swiveled to the source. The speaker was a man in his early 60s, with a mane of silver hair and a face that spoke of years spent in boardrooms. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, but his eyes, sharp and intelligent, behind a pair of wire-rimmed glasses, held none of Karen's arrogance. He carefully folded the copy of the Wall Street Journal he was reading and placed it on his lap. This was Mr. Robert Henderson, CEO of a global investment firm, a man whose quiet words carried more weight than Karen's loudest shouts. "You will stop harassing this young man immediately," Henderson stated. It was not a request. It was a command. Karen Miller whirled on him, her fury now redirected. "And who are you to tell me what to do? This has nothing to do with you." "On the contrary," Henderson replied, his voice remaining level and measured. "It has everything to do with me. It has everything to do with everyone in this cabin. You are creating a hostile and offensive environment. You have made baseless accusations against a fellow passenger based on nothing more than it seems your own prejudice." "Prejudice," she scoffed, clutching her pearls in a display of theatrical outrage. "It's not prejudice, it's common sense. Look at him. He's a child in a sweatshirt. I am simply trying to maintain the integrity of this cabin." Robert Henderson slowly shook his head, a look of profound disappointment on his face. "The only thing you're damaging is your own integrity, madam. I've been flying first class for over 30 years. I've seen people in here wearing everything from Savile Row suits to track suits. The price of a ticket is not determined by one's wardrobe, nor by the color of one's skin. It is determined by a credit card transaction. Now I suggest you return to your seat and apologize to this young man for your abhorrent behavior." Karen's face turned a mottled shade of red and white. Being challenged was an experience she was clearly unfamiliar with, and being dressed down by a man who so obviously belonged to the world she aspired to command was a bitter pill to swallow. Just as she opened her mouth to retort, another voice joined the chorus. "He's right, you know." Dr. Emily Chen, a young cardiothoracic surgeon on her way to a medical conference, looked up from her seat. "Your behavior is completely unacceptable. You should be ashamed of yourself." A murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. An older woman in 3D nodded emphatically. A man in 1C gave Jordan a small, encouraging smile. The invisible wall between the passengers had dissolved. They were no longer a collection of individuals. They were a community, and its collective conscience had been awakened. It was at this moment that Grace, the flight attendant, finally reached the epicenter of the conflict. Her face was set in a firm, professional mask, but her eyes conveyed a clear message of support to Jordan. "Ma'am, is there a problem here?" she asked Karen, her tone polite, but brooking no nonsense. "Yes, there is a problem," Karen shrieked, pointing at Jordan again. "This boy doesn't belong here. I want you to check his ticket. I'm certain it's fraudulent." "I will not be doing that, based on your unsubstantiated claims," Grace said calmly. She then turned her full attention to Jordan, her voice softening considerably. "Sir, I am so sorry you are being subjected to this. Are you all right?" Jordan, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally found his voice. "I'm fine," he said, though his heart was still racing. "But she's causing a major disturbance." "I am aware," Grace acknowledged. She then turned back to Karen Miller. "Ma'am, I need you to return to your seat, now." "I will not move until he is removed," Karen insisted, stamping her foot like a petulant child. Grace's patience, which had been stretched to its limit, finally snapped. Her professional demeanor remained, but her voice now had an edge of steel. "Very well. In that case, I will need to see both of your boarding passes." She looked at Karen. "And your passport. We will sort this out right now." The request seemed to stun Karen. The idea that her own credentials would be questioned alongside Jordan's was an insult she hadn't anticipated. But Robert Henderson, Dr. Chen, and now Grace had formed an unbreakable line of defense. The ripple of support had become a wave, and Karen Miller was about to be swept away by a current of decency she had completely underestimated. With trembling hands, she began to rummage through her purse, her confident bluster beginning to fade into a panicked, desperate scramble. The act of presenting her credentials was for Karen Miller a fundamental violation of her worldview. In her mind, she was the one who inspected others, not the one to be inspected. With a hand that shook from a mixture of rage and adrenaline, she produced her gold-embossed passport holder and the crisp printout of her boarding pass. She practically threw them at Grace, as if the very act of handing them over was beneath her. Jordan, meanwhile, calmly reached into the seat pocket, retrieved his boarding pass, and handed it to the flight attendant. Grace took both documents and examined them under the soft cabin light. She scanned Jordan's pass first. Jordan Carter, Seat 2A, Priority Boarding Destination, Geneva. Everything is in perfect order. Welcome aboard, Mr. Carter. She gave him a reassuring nod before turning her attention to Karen's documents. Karen Miller, Seat 2D. Your pass is also in order, Mrs. Miller. She handed the documents back to their respective owners. Now, Grace said, her voice leaving no room for argument. As you can see, both passengers are ticketed for their seats. Mr. Carter has every right to be here. I must now insist for the final time that you return to your seat and cease this disruption. For a rational person, this would have been the end of it. It would have been a moment for a shame-faced retreat, and a quiet, miserable flight. But Karen Miller was far beyond the shores of rationality. Her entire sense of self, built on a fragile foundation of perceived status and superiority, had been publicly challenged. Backing down was not an option. It would be an admission of defeat. "In order," she sneered, her voice dripping with disbelief. "I don't believe it for a second. This is some kind of mistake, or a scam. Did his mommy and daddy buy it for him with their welfare checks?" A collective gasp went through the cabin. The comment was so overtly racist, so grotesquely vile, that it sucked the remaining air out of the space. Robert Henderson, who had been watching with quiet intensity, now looked utterly disgusted. Dr. Chen physically recoiled. Jordan flinched, as if he'd been struck. The mention of his parents, the very people whose hard work and love had placed him in that seat, was a line too far. But before he could speak, Grace stepped directly in front of Karen, creating a physical barrier between her and Jordan. "That is enough," Grace said, her voice now dangerously low. "You have verbally harassed a minor, made racist and classist accusations, and you are refusing to comply with the instructions of the cabin crew. You are in violation of federal aviation regulations." Karen Miller seemed to swell with indignation. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she hissed, a classic, desperate gambit of the powerless. "I am Karen Miller. I was a senior vice president at Sterling Thorne Financial until last month. I have connections. I will have your job for this. I will sue this airline into the ground. I will own this plane." The frantic name-dropping tirade had the opposite of its intended effect. The mention of "until last month" was a crucial slip, a crack in her facade that revealed the desperation beneath the bluster. Robert Henderson's eyebrows shot up in recognition. Sterling Thorne. He knew the company well. They had recently undergone a massive, messy restructuring, laying off dozens of senior executives who were deemed redundant. Karen Miller wasn't a powerful executive on a business trip. She was an unemployed woman flying to what was likely a last-chance interview, trying to cling to the vestiges of a status she no longer possessed. Her aggression wasn't born of strength, but of profound weakness and fear. "Your former employment status is irrelevant, Mrs. Miller," Grace stated flatly. "Your behavior on this aircraft is the only thing that matters right now. Return to your seat, or I will be forced to inform the captain." "Go ahead," Karen shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Call the captain. I'll tell him myself what's going on. I'll tell him how his crew is allowing riffraff to overrun the premium cabins." In a final misguided act of defiance, she reached out and tried to snatch Jordan's boarding pass from his hand, as if it were the one piece of evidence she needed to prove her delusional theory. "Let me see that I'll prove it's a fake." Jordan pulled his hand back instinctively. The physical contact, the violation of his personal space, crossed a final boundary. Grace caught Karen's wrist. "Do not touch my passenger," she commanded, her voice like ice. The unraveling was complete. Karen Miller was no longer an elite passenger. She was a security threat. Grace released her wrist, pulled out her service handset from her apron, and pressed the button to call the flight deck. The entire cabin watched in stunned silence. The conflict had escalated beyond a simple argument. The authority of the flight crew had been challenged, a passenger had been assaulted, and now the pilots were involved. The fate of Flight 87, and everyone on it, now rested with the calm voice that would soon come from the cockpit. The call to the flight deck was brief and professional. Grace spoke in low, clipped tones, outlining the situation with practiced efficiency. Unruly passenger, refusing to comply with crew instructions, harassment of another passenger. As she spoke, an absolute hush fell over the first-class cabin. Even Karen Miller, seemed to momentarily grasp the gravity of what she had set in motion, her face paling slightly as she watched Grace speak into the handset. A few moments after Grace hung up, the intercom crackled to life. A crisp female voice with a faint Eastern European accent filled the cabin. It was a voice that radiated calm authority and absolute control. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Eva Rostova, speaking from the flight deck." There was a pause, and in that brief silence, every passenger leaned in an entire cabin holding its breath. This was not a standard announcement about turbulence or flight time. "We have been made aware of a disturbance in the first-class cabin." Captain Rostova continued her tone even, but infused with an unmistakable seriousness. "Let me be perfectly clear. Swiss International Airlines has a zero-tolerance policy for harassment, discrimination, and aggression of any kind towards our crew or our passengers. The safety, security, and comfort of everyone on board is our absolute and non-negotiable priority." She paused again, letting the weight of her words sink in. She didn't single out Karen by name, but her message was laser-focused. "The cabin crew are my representatives on this aircraft. Their instructions are to be followed without argument or delay. Their authority is final. When a passenger creates a disturbance, they are not only disrespecting the crew and their fellow travelers, they are creating a potential safety issue." Jordan looked at Karen Miller. Her face, which had been a mask of defiant rage just moments before, was now a mixture of shock and disbelief. She seemed to be processing that this wasn't just a flight attendant she was arguing with anymore. She was now in direct opposition to the commander of the aircraft. "We have a passenger who has been repeatedly asked to cease their disruptive behavior and return to their seat." Captain Rostova's voice continued as clear as a bell. "This is the final warning. You have 60 seconds to comply with the flight attendant's instructions and sit down. If you fail to do so, I will have no alternative but to return this aircraft to the gate at John F. Kennedy International Airport, where you will be met by the Port Authority Police." The ultimatum was stunning in its finality. Returning to the gate was a drastic measure, an enormous inconvenience for everyone on board, involving fuel consumption, lost time, and logistical chaos. For a captain to make that decision, the infraction had to be severe. Eva Rostova was making it clear that the behavior of one passenger had now threatened the journey of all. "The clock is ticking." Captain Rostova concluded her voice, leaving no doubt that she was not bluffing. The intercom clicked off, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more profound than any before it. All eyes turned back to Karen Miller. This was her moment of choice. She could swallow her pride, sit down, and endure the rest of the flight in humiliated silence, or she could push her defiance to its ultimate conclusion. Grace, the flight attendant, looked at her, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Miller, your seat." Karen stood frozen, her mind visibly racing. Jordan could almost see the gears turning. He saw the flicker of panic in her eyes as the reality of being arrested, of being publicly shamed on an even grander scale, began to dawn on her. But it was warring with a lifetime of unchecked entitlement. To sit down now would be to admit she was wrong. It would be to accept that this black teenager in a hoodie had more right to be there than she did. Her face hardened. The panic was replaced by a final, fatal surge of pride. She lifted her chin defiantly. "This is absurd," she muttered, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Completely absurd." She did not move. She glanced around the cabin, perhaps looking for a single ally, a single face that shared her outrage. She found none. She saw only stern, disapproving stares. She saw Robert Henderson watching her with cold pity. She saw Dr. Chen shaking her head in disgust, and she saw Jordan Carter not looking at her with triumph, but with a quiet, weary sadness. The 60 seconds felt like an eternity. Grace didn't speak again. She simply stood and waited. The entire cabin waited. Then through the cockpit door, they could all hear the captain's voice speaking to air traffic control. A moment later, the gentle forward momentum of the aircraft ceased. With a slow, deliberate groan, the massive Airbus began a long, graceful turn, reversing its course on the taxiway. They were going back. Captain Rostova had kept her word. Karen Miller had made her choice, and now everyone on board would face the consequences. But the most severe consequences were reserved for her alone. The taxi back to the gate was the most surreal and silent journey any of the passengers had ever experienced. The low rumble of the engines was the only sound, a funereal hum that underscored the tension in the cabin. No one spoke. No one dared to even whisper. All eyes were on Karen Miller, who stood frozen in the aisle, her face a pale, slack mask of disbelief. The reality of the situation had finally crashed down upon her. She hadn't won. She hadn't put Jordan in his place. She had grounded an entire international flight. When the aircraft finally docked with the jet bridge, a soft chime rang through the cabin, the same sound that usually signaled the beginning of a journey. Tonight, it signaled the end of one. Captain Rostova's voice came over the intercom one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived back at the gate. The ground crew is connecting the jet bridge now. We ask that you all remain seated until the authorities have boarded the aircraft and resolved the situation. We apologize for the significant delay this will cause, but I thank you for your patience and understanding." Her voice was still calm, but there was an undercurrent of profound disappointment. She was apologizing to them for the disruption Karen had caused. The front cabin door opened with a hydraulic hiss. A moment later, 2 Port Authority police officers stepped onto the plane. They were large, imposing figures in dark blue uniforms, their expressions grim and all business. They conferred quietly with Grace, who pointed discreetly towards Karen Miller. One of the officers approached her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "My name is Officer Daniels. We're going to have to ask you to come with us." Karen looked at him, then around the cabin at the sea of faces watching her. Her last shred of defiance seemed to crumble, replaced by a raw, naked panic. "No," she whispered. "This is a misunderstanding. I was just—" "Ma'am, please," the officer said, his voice a little harder now. "Grab your belongings. We're not going to discuss this here. Let's go." The second officer stood by his hand, resting near his belt, a silent but clear indication that this was not a negotiation. Defeated Karen Miller turned and fumbled with the latch of the overhead bin. Her hands were shaking so badly, she could barely open it. She pulled down her stiff leather briefcase and her carry-on bag. Then began the long walk of shame. As she turned to walk down the aisle toward the open door, a strange and beautiful thing happened. The silence was broken not by jeers or insults, but by a sound that started in the back of the first-class cabin and spread forward. It was a slow, deliberate, and unified round of applause. It wasn't a celebratory or triumphant applause. It was an applause of solidarity. It was for Jordan. It was for Grace, the flight attendant who had stood her ground. It was for Captain Rostova, who had refused to compromise on decency. It was a clear, unequivocal statement from every passenger in that cabin: we stand with him, not with you. The sound seemed to physically strike Karen Miller. She flinched, her shoulders hunching as she scurried down the aisle, her head down, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. The applause followed her every step, a steady, rhythmic verdict on her character. As she passed Jordan's seat, she risked a final fleeting glance at him. He wasn't clapping. He wasn't smiling. He simply watched her go, his expression a complex mixture of relief, pity, and the deep, weary sorrow of someone who has been forced to endure an ugliness they did not invite. In that moment, he felt no victory, only a profound sense of loss that such hatred could exist in the world. The officers escorted her off the plane and onto the jet bridge. As she disappeared from view, the cabin door was closed, but the applause continued for a few moments longer before tapering off into a renewed but now relieved silence. Grace walked over to Jordan's seat and knelt beside him. "Are you okay, really?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. Jordan nodded, letting out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Yeah, thank you for everything. It's my job to keep my passengers safe," she said with a small smile. "All of my passengers." From across the aisle, Robert Henderson leaned over. "Young man," he said, his voice warm with respect, "you handled that with more grace and maturity than most adults I know. Don't let that woman's ignorance dim your light for 1 second." Jordan managed a grateful smile. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." The plane would be delayed for nearly 3 hours as they refueled and filed the necessary reports. But no one complained. A sense of community had been forged in the crucible of that ugly confrontation. They had all witnessed something vile, but they had also witnessed something powerful, a group of complete strangers choosing to stand together for what was right. As the plane finally took off for the second time that night, soaring into the dark sky, Jordan Carter looked out of the window at the lights of New York receding below. He was still on his way to his future, but he was carrying a new heavy lesson with him. The world could be a hostile place, but it also held a surprising capacity for solidarity and kindness. 3 weeks later, Jordan Carter was back home in New York, a bronze medal from the Global Youth Innovators Summit hanging in his room. He hadn't won the top prize, but being a finalist had opened up a world of possibilities. He had scholarship offers, internship opportunities, and a newfound confidence in his abilities. The incident on the plane had become a surreal memory, a story he had recounted to his horrified but proud parents. It had been an ugly experience, but the support he received had overshadowed the hate. The story, however, had taken on a life of its own. Robert Henderson, true to his character, hadn't let the matter rest. The day after the flight, he had posted a detailed, though anonymized, account of the incident on his LinkedIn profile. He didn't name Karen Miller or Jordan, but he praised the professionalism of Captain Eva Rostova and the Swissair crew, and he condemned the appalling display of prejudice he had witnessed. As a highly respected CEO with thousands of followers, his post went viral. It was picked up by news outlets, sparking a wider conversation about racism and entitlement in air travel. Swiss International Airlines, in response to the public outcry and their own internal investigation, issued a formal public apology for the incident and confirmed that the disruptive passenger had been banned from the airline for life. They also reached out to Jordan's family privately, offering him a full refund and a voucher for future travel, which his parents graciously accepted. Jordan was content to leave it at that. He didn't want his name attached to the story. He wanted to be known for his intellect and his innovations, not as a victim of a viral incident. He was ready to move on. Karma, however, was not. Meanwhile, in a sterile conference room in Geneva, Robert Henderson sat at the head of a large mahogany table. He was a board member for Dufort and C, one of Switzerland's oldest and most prestigious private banks. They were in the final stages of hiring a new head of North American operations, a critical role that required impeccable judgment, international savvy, and unwavering integrity. They had narrowed it down to 2 candidates. The next candidate, his fellow board member announced, is a Miss Karen Miller. Her resume is quite impressive on paper. 20 years at Sterling Thorne, extensive experience, though her departure was rather abrupt. Robert Henderson sat up straight. Karen Miller. The name was so common, he thought it had to be a coincidence. But then, through the large glass wall of the conference room, he saw her. It was the same woman from the plane, the same severe blonde hair, the same pinched expression. Though today it was arranged into a desperate, ingratiating smile as she waited in the reception area. A cold, clear understanding washed over him. He remembered her frantic boast on the plane. "I was a senior vice president at Sterling Thorne Financial until last month." He remembered her destination, Geneva. She hadn't been on a holiday. She had been flying to this very interview. This was her last-ditch effort to save a failing career. He let the preliminary video interview which he had missed due to his travel play on the screen before him. There she was, speaking in corporate platitudes about synergy and shareholder value. But all Henderson could see was her face contorted in a hateful sneer, screaming at a 17-year-old boy. He could hear her racist insults, her arrogant threats. When it was his turn to speak, he chose his words carefully. "Gentlemen," he said to the other board members, "while a candidate's resume and interview performance are important, I believe character is the ultimate metric for a leadership position at this bank. Integrity, emotional intelligence, and how one treats people when they think no one of consequence is watching, that is what truly defines a leader." He then recounted the entire story of the flight, this time leaving out no details, including the passenger's name. The woman waiting outside for her final interview, Karen Miller, is the same woman who was forcibly removed from my flight to Geneva by police for racially abusing a child. A stunned silence filled the boardroom. The other members looked at him, then at the resume, then back at him, their expressions turning from confusion to horror. The decision was made before another word was spoken. A few minutes later, an assistant entered the reception area where Karen Miller was anxiously smoothing her pantsuit for the 10th time. "Miss Miller, thank you for coming in, but the board has decided to move in a different direction. The position has been filled." The color drained from Karen's face. "What, but I haven't even had my interview yet. There must be a mistake." "There is no mistake," the assistant replied coolly. "Have a nice day." Karen Miller never found out exactly why her final chance had evaporated. She never knew that the man she had dismissed as just another passenger was the final gatekeeper to her future. Her actions at 35,000 feet, born of her own insecurity and prejudice, had created a ripple effect she could never have anticipated. She had tried to eject a young man from a world she felt he didn't belong in, and in doing so had permanently ejected herself from the very world she so desperately wanted to rejoin. Back in New York, Jordan Carter logged onto his computer and began coding his mind focused on algorithms and possibilities. He was building the future one line of code at a time, completely unaware that halfway across the world, a final definitive act of justice had just been served. 6 months had passed, and the winter snows had begun to dust the rooftops of New York City. The incident on Flight 87 had receded in Jordan Carter's mind becoming less of a sharp, painful memory and more of a surreal anecdote, a story that felt like it had happened to someone else. Life had moved on with the relentless pace of a senior year of high school. The bronze medal from Geneva had led to a feature in a teen tech magazine, which in turn had led to early acceptance letters from both MIT and Caltech. His water purification app, now named Mangrove, had attracted the interest of a small environmental NGO. He was busy-focused and building the future he had always envisioned. His connection with Robert Henderson had solidified into a quiet, respectful mentorship. They exchanged emails every few weeks. Jordan would send updates on his college applications, and Henderson would reply with surprisingly thoughtful advice on everything from course selection to the importance of networking. He never mentioned Karen Miller or the ugly specifics of their meeting. Their correspondence was forward-looking, a silent acknowledgement that they had met during a storm, but would now focus on the calm seas ahead. Jordan saw him as a valuable guide, a man who had reached the pinnacles of success and was for some reason willing to extend a hand to a kid from Queens. He had no idea how deeply that night had affected Henderson as well. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, sandwiched between a notification from his calculus study group and a promotional offer for pizza. The sender was Dufour and CE, and the subject line was Formal Invitation Keynote Address at the Innovation and Global Citizenship Gala. Jordan almost deleted it as spam. Curiosity, however, made him click it open. His eyes scanned the formal letter-headed text. Pleasure to invite you, Mr. Jordan Carter, to be our honored guest and keynote speaker. Annual Gala in Geneva. Launch of our new philanthropic endeavor, the Horizon Initiative. Dedicated to funding and mentoring young technologists and innovators from underrepresented communities. Jordan's breath hitched. He scrolled down his heart, beginning to pound in his chest. The email detailed a generous honorarium, a business-class flight for him and his parents, and a 5-night stay at the Four Seasons Hotel de Berge on the shore of Lake Geneva. It was an offer of stunning, almost unbelievable prestige. At the very bottom of the email, he found the sentence that connected all the dots. This invitation comes at the direct and enthusiastic recommendation of Mr. Robert Henderson, a distinguished member of our board, who believes your voice expertise, and most importantly your character, perfectly embody the spirit of this new initiative. He sat back in his chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating his stunned face. This was more than just a speaking gig. A Swiss private bank, one of the oldest and most respected financial institutions in the world, was creating a multi-million-dollar program to help kids like him. And it had all stemmed from that one flight, from one woman's hate and one man's decision to speak up. The irony was staggering. He printed the email and waited by the door for his parents to come home, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. The pre-gala reception was held in a magnificent ballroom overlooking Lake Geneva. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the famous jet d'eau fountain soared into the twilight sky, illuminated against the backdrop of the distant Alps. Waiters moved silently through the crowd of European financiers, diplomats and academics, carrying trays of champagne and intricate hors d'oeuvres. Jordan, standing beside his parents, who looked on with a kind of dazed parental pride, felt a world away from his bedroom in Queens. He wore his first-ever tailored suit, a gift from Henderson, who had insisted on having his personal tailor fit Jordan upon his arrival. "You clean up well, young man," a familiar voice said from behind him. Jordan turned to see Robert Henderson approaching, a broad, genuine smile on his face. He looked different here, more relaxed and in his element than he had on the plane. "Mr. Henderson, I don't even know what to say, thank you." "Call me Robert, please," Henderson said, shaking Jordan's hand firmly and then warmly greeting his parents. "And you have nothing to thank me for. You're the one who earned this. We're just providing the platform." He gestured around the opulent room. "That incident on the flight. It stuck with me, Jordan. It was a catalyst. I sat in board meetings for years, listening to talk about diversity and inclusion. But it was all just corporate jargon. Watching you handle that situation with such dignity and seeing that woman's absolute conviction that you couldn't possibly belong in a space you had every right to occupy. It made it real. It made me realize we weren't doing enough. We were waiting for talent to knock on our door, assuming it would always look and sound a certain way. The Horizon Initiative is our attempt to go out and actively open those doors." He looked Jordan directly in the eye. "Your quiet courage in the face of that ugliness inspired us to create this entire program. What that woman intended for evil, we are determined to use for good. You're not just our first keynote speaker, Jordan. You are our first success story." Jordan was speechless. He had seen the incident as something he had survived. He never imagined it could be the foundation for something so vast and positive. Just then, Henderson's eyes lit up as he looked toward the ballroom entrance. "Ah, good. They made it." Jordan followed his gaze and saw two women in elegant formal wear being greeted at the door. One was the flight attendant, Grace Evans, looking radiant in a dark blue gown. The other, tall and commanding with a regal posture, was Captain Eva Rostova. Henderson had used the bank's resources to track them both down and had flown them in as his personal guests. He led Jordan over to them. Grace's face broke into a huge smile when she saw him. "Jordan, look at you. A suit and everything. A lot calmer than the last time we saw each other." Jordan laughed, feeling a genuine warmth and camaraderie. "It's so good to see you, Grace." Captain Rostova extended a hand, her handshake, as firm and confident as her voice had been over the intercom. "Mr. Carter, it is an honor to meet you properly." Her accent was just as he remembered, crisp and authoritative, but her eyes held a warm respect. "I have flown for 25 years. I have dealt with medical emergencies, mechanical failures, and terrible storms. But the most challenging situations are always the human ones. That night you showed a composure under pressure that many of my senior first officers would envy." "I was just trying to get to my competition," Jordan said humbly. "No," Captain Rostova corrected him gently. "You were doing more than that. You were asserting your right to exist in a space peacefully. As a pilot, my primary job is to ensure the safety of my passengers. That safety isn't just about the integrity of the fuselage. It's about the integrity of our shared humanity. The crew, the passengers who spoke up, we all did our jobs that night. But you reminded us why those jobs matter." Standing there surrounded by this unlikely group of allies forged in a moment of airborne crisis. A CEO, a pilot, a flight attendant, and his parents, Jordan felt a profound sense of connection that transcended the glamour of the event. They were his Geneva connection, a testament to the fact that strangers could in an instant become a community. Later that evening, Jordan stood at the podium, looking out at the hundreds of faces in the audience. He had prepared a speech full of technical details about his app and statistics on the global water crisis. But in that moment, seeing Robert, Eva, and Grace sitting at the front table, he set his prepared notes aside. He spoke from the heart. He didn't mention Karen Miller or the specifics of the confrontation. He didn't need to. Instead, he spoke about invisible barriers and unspoken assumptions. He talked about the power of a single voice to break a deafening silence. Innovation isn't just about code or circuits, he said, his voice clear and steady. It's about connection. It's about seeing the potential in a person that the world might overlook because they're looking at the wrong things at their clothes, their age, their skin. The greatest breakthroughs happen when we are seen for who we are and what we can contribute. Sometimes all it takes is one person, a stranger on a plane, a teacher in a classroom, a mentor in a boardroom, to stand up and say, "I see you. You belong here." That is the moment the future truly begins. His speech was met with a thunderous standing ovation. Afterwards, as the gala wound down, Jordan stepped out onto a quiet balcony overlooking the lake. The night air was cold and clean. Robert Henderson came and stood beside him, and for a long moment they watched the city lights twinkle on the dark water in comfortable silence. "You have a big future ahead of you, Jordan," Robert said finally. "I know," Jordan replied, a newfound certainty in his voice. "And I know I'm not walking toward it alone." The journey to Geneva had been turbulent, marred by an ugliness he would never forget. But the arrival both then and now was more beautiful than he could have ever imagined. The karma from that flight hadn't just been a punishment delivered, it was a blessing received. The hatred of one person had inadvertently illuminated a path for him, a path now lined with powerful and decent people who saw him for exactly who he was, a young man who belonged and who was just getting started. That night on Flight 87, a cabin full of strangers did more than just fly from one continent to another. They showed us the incredible power of solidarity. They proved that when good people refuse to be silent, bystanders, hate and prejudice have nowhere to hide. Jordan's story isn't just about a terrible incident. It's a powerful reminder that our true character is revealed in how we treat others, especially when we have nothing to gain. The world can feel divided, but as the passengers on that flight demonstrated, a small act of courage can ripple outwards, creating a wave of change. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that matter. And in the comments below, tell us about a time you saw someone stand up for what was right. Let's keep this conversation going.